Hello everyone, I'm Wendell Jones and welcome to this edition of our program, Jones and Company. On this program, we examine the national issues of the Bahamas. This has been a very difficult time for teachers, students, and parents, indeed for administrators in education throughout the Bahamas, given COVID-19 and all that we had to go through. And of course, we are still in a period where we do not know exactly what is going to happen in the immediate future. But there are plans in the Ministry of Education for the schooling of our children, for examinations and all of this. And so we have invited on our program today officials of the Ministry of Education to speak about their plans for COVID-19 moving forward, and indeed how we are going to have children take examinations and the future of schooling for the next year or so. Our guest on the program today, the Director of Education, Mr. Marcellus Taylor, and the Undersecretary in the Ministry of Education, Sarita Clarke. And it's a pleasure to have both of them here today. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Marcellus Taylor is a regular on our program, and this is the first time, I believe, that we have
Yes, sir.
Ms. Clarke here on our program today. But these have been very challenging times, Mr. Director.
Certainly. You know, as I say to teachers and others who I speak to, you know, it's like COVID-19 came out of the blue. We heard about it happening in China and all of that, and so there was an awareness of how disruptive it could be. But it came to the West so quickly, and it interrupted things so quickly and at levels that I didn't think it would happen. I mean, you know, when we think of the concept of a curfew, right? When I was growing up, you think about the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain and
Yes.
Cuba maybe, you know. You wouldn't think that a curfew would come into the Bahamas, but we've had curfews now for 3 months. And certainly, you know, the disruption to the economy and the movement of persons and so on. But you know, the good thing about it is we were able to respond to it to some degree, so that although there are a lot of concerns about COVID-19, I think in the Ministry of Education we have a confidence that we could and we have responded sufficiently, and I would argue appropriately, so that the interruption to the children's education was kept at a minimal. So we were able to launch our virtual learning platform, and in that we were able to, within 1 week, put content on there for students. And then within 2 weeks' time, we had live classes going on, so that as much as you could make it normal, teaching remotely is what we were able to do. And indeed, what we were able to do was kind of an enhancement or enrichment of what we had started to do already at the beginning of this academic year for students in the remote areas of our country. So in Meguana and in Stanley Key, Exuma, and places like that, we had already started providing students education virtually. So for years we've been talking about distance learning, and so we started that. And having that experience to some degree gave us a bit of competency, but also a confidence that even though we were in crisis, we could scale up. And the response by all players, including the technical officers of the ministry, district superintendents, teachers on the ground, and so forth, it was kind of a wonderful thing to see and experience, that people, instead of hiding in the corner, you know, the sky is falling and we can't do this and we can't do that and how we can make it and whatever, looked it in the face, looked it in the eye and say, well, we'll find a way to defeat you, COVID-19. And I think we did.
There have been islands not affected by COVID-19. There weren't any cases of COVID-19, say, in the Central and Southern Bahamas. And there's a school of thought that classes ought to have been able to continue without the restrictions, without the need for all of the technology that were employed in places like New Providence and Grand Bahama. Did you put on yourselves more of a burden to deal with the entire Bahamas virtually, rather than allowing teachers to go to work in Mayagona and Acklands and other places such?
Well, you asked the question if we put a burden on ourselves. I just want to be very clear that we were being guided through this whole process by what the public health officials were recommending, and also what it is that the competent authority was prescribing. And so if there was an order for people in Acklands and in Exuma and in any of the other islands that didn't have any cases of COVID, but that they were not able to move around, then we could not go against that. So the Most Honorable Prime Minister laid out a five-phase plan for the reintroduction of school. I would say in hindsight, perhaps that same plan should have been developed for each island, so that as islands were in certain conditions, they could move to different phases and then different things could happen. But of course, it's hindsight. And then that way, we would have been able to have classes. But we couldn't have classes if the condition was in the country that you must follow these prescriptions.
Yes.
Yeah, so, I mean, it wasn't really like a indifference on our part. It was following a command.
But didn't you have, Ms. Clarke, challenges with the technology that some students weren't able to get online, for instance?
In some instances, some students did not have devices, and then the network in some areas students could not access. So basically, those things were taken into consideration, and Mr. Taylor, the director, and his team would have been able to provide avenues other than just the technology to ensure the continuation of education.
But these students were disadvantaged then in some of these islands.
Well, there are some pros and cons. And when you talk about the disadvantages, we can basically say that maybe they did not receive the same lesson as those persons who were on the virtual platform. They would have actually had an opportunity to use their notebooks. They would have had teachers access to be able to give them additional information. But if they were all following the curriculum and basically following the examination syllabi, those students should have been able to help themselves with the teacher's assistance and also with the assistance of cable channels as well.
And you had some organic activity in some of these family islands, right? Where you would have things like in Inagua, for instance, the students were permitted to come to the school site if they didn't have internet connectivity and download, using the Wi-Fi that we have, leaving it open, download their work and then return home to go and finish it off. So, for instance, Ms. Colley, who was the principal there, we talked and she coordinated all that with the police, gave the children a period of time to come, ensure that they were socially distanced, and then download whatever they needed and then go home. And of course, teachers in those communities, in the province as well, but because of the nature of the communities where you could have the connection with parents and a much stronger relationship with, the home factor, being in contact and supporting students in a lot more deliberate ways. So we didn't micromanage those things because we realized that the conditions on the ground were different. But as a ministry and as a department, we had to follow the prescription that was laid out. I mean, we just can't ignore the prescription. We couldn't say, oh, schools are opened in these islands when the government has said that the activity in those islands should be limited.
What about actual access to instruments? The minister came on one of my programs and talked about tablets being available to students of a certain grouping.
Yeah, in some of the Family Islands, we were able to allow for the use of some of the tablets and devices that were in schools. Like for instance, in Meguana, the students were already, in the secondary school, they were already being taught virtually. So there are 17 of them there, and we were able to, in the secondary school, and we were able to permit them to utilize those devices, you know, in their home space and so on. It was a lot more difficult to do that in New Providence because, I don't know how to say this, but in the Family Islands you have much more of an environment that causes people to conform. So if, let's say, you know, 17 children make one, and 2 children don't bring the devices back, everybody know who the 2 children are, everybody know who got the device in their house, everybody know if you sell it to somebody, so you get busted very easily, very shame. So you will letting the community down. In New Providence, the minute the children walk out the gate, you can't really trace it, you know? So there's some social factors that would permit us to be a little bit more, or to allow for more flexibility in those environments than let's say in New Providence, where we know we'd have to put a lot more systems in place to prevent the loss of devices. Because what we have to be careful of is, yes, we want to help people and we want people to get access and so forth. And some people, they say, well, okay, give it to them and let them take it home. But would it be a responsible thing for us not to be able to account to the taxpayers of the Bahamas that we gave out, you know, 12,000 tablets and only 9,000 came back? I mean, then what do you do? You know? So that I think that is part of our dilemma at this point. How do we ensure that we provide access, yes, to those who need, but we also safeguard the resources of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas?
Talking about accounting to the taxpayers, and you're the undersecretary, this must be, you must have had a significant cost involved in this entire program and making it happen, yes?
Yes, not only in terms of providing the instructional program, but also there is a national school lunch program that the Ministry of Education has. And throughout the period of COVID-19, we tried to continue providing lunch to our students who were on that program.
Even though they were home?
Yes, we had 2 distributions where persons, the first one we actually used local vendors to provide lunch in terms of fast food eateries. And then for the second distribution, we had a $50 redeemable at the food stores. And persons came, we had about 4,000 plus vouchers that were distributed throughout the entire Bahamas.
But why was that necessary when parents were home? Parents were assisting children at home. They weren't at work. They didn't have, the children didn't have to leave home. Why was that necessary? Isn't that, some people would think it was an unnecessary expenditure on the part of the government.
But as you know, there are a number of persons, many persons. I think the unemployment rate in the country now is probably up to about 30 or more %. And so these students were regularly, every day, they got their lunch at school. School was closed because of COVID. So it was the ministry's obligation to ensure that they would have received something during those 5 days out of the week, that they would have gotten it at school.
Okay.
And just to me add something to that. These are children who were already living in poverty before COVID-19.
Some of them.
Majority of them.
Essentially, all of the children, because this program is a social assistance program that we have in place that targets children who come to school without meals on the regular.
So there was a means test then to determine who should get these free meals.
So when the program initially started, social services was involved, and they actually interviewed, they did home visits to determine the needs of the family. And so those students were actually placed on the list, and so the list would have been sent to the Ministry of Education every year, and so we basically would have also had students who were added to it, because the principals or the administrators or the guidance counselors in the schools saw students who came every day to the area where the lunch was being distributed and asked if they could have lunch. And so schools over a period of time would have been adding names to that list as well.
Mainly schools in New Providence.
Throughout the entire
Throughout the Bahamas?
Yes, sir.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and ordinarily that program is, attached where that the student has to come to the school to receive the meal. And it's an incentive, I guess, if you look at it that way, for children to come to school so that they can indeed benefit from the quality of education that is provided. But also, you have to cater to the whole person. So,
And if the child is not fed, then basically in terms of them being able to concentrate and function in a classroom, they will not be able to do that. So education has a dual responsibility.
Yes. Has there been any way of assessing how the program worked, the virtual learning program work, in terms of whether children were getting from this what they ought to get, whether teachers were frustrated in communicating or in educating the children? Has there been any survey done on the effectiveness of the virtual learning program?
well, our planning unit was responsible for putting together a survey. They're still in the process of reporting on it. I understand that another group, Alive or somebody with the Bahamas Union of Teachers, may have done a survey as well. These surveys, that one and the one that we did, they are more around issues of access and whether people participated or not. So, this whole issue of whether the program was effective is one that we didn't really address at the point in time. Remember, we started this in March as a response to COVID-19. So what we developed was a very basic platform, and it didn't permit us to put in place all of the analytics that we would need, all the stuff in order to get all the information that we would need. During the process, we engaged a group called One on One, and One on One is a group out of Jamaica, and they provide these kind of solutions. And one of the things that they have in their program is this LMS, which is a learning management system, which would then permit you to do things like know who's on, know what period of time that they're on, which subjects they're going on, and then eventually do things like build in assessments so that you could know what skills students are acquiring before and after they've received instruction, to see how effective the tuition was. So as we move forward, and we believe that virtual learning has its place, and we believe that we should continue to build that platform, not only in the case of emergency. The Bahamas is always prone to some kind of trauma or crisis or hurricane or whatever coming up, but also infusing it into the regular instruction so that we could augment and even in some cases provide for learning in opportunities where we can't at this present time. We would have this LMS built into whatever we do so that we could be able to know just how effective the program is, and more importantly, help students with the diagnosis and the teachers with the diagnosis of where students are, so that the teaching and learning process could adjust to what the student requires.
Schools are closed now, and many parents are wondering what is going to happen at the end of the summer. Whether the Ministry of Education is going to encourage students to go back to school. COVID-19 is going to be with us for a little while until there's a vaccine. What is the ministry thinking in terms of the reopening of school? Are you going to continue with the virtual learning, or are you going to open the classrooms?
So for us at this point in time, there are like three main options we see for us. And what really makes a difference as to which option we might engage is primarily this issue of the social distancing and the containment of disease spread and that kind of thing. So the three options would be this. that we return to school pretty much as we were before COVID-19. But of course, we know that, if social distancing rules are as rigid as they are, then it's highly unlikely that we'd be able to exercise that option. Second option would be some sort of reduced number of hours of students being in the school. And so you might engage in some kind of a shift system where students might come to school for 2 days out of the week and stay at home for 3 days out of the week. If we were to do that, then the virtual learning will then be involved in that process, so that you would have a blended learning approach where when you're at home, you will engage virtually. When you're at a school site, you'll have face-to-face engagement with a teacher or with teachers. And then the third option would be the option that we had to exercise during the months of March, April, May, and June, which is all instruction virtually. Of course, our preference would be for the first option, because this is what we know best. This is where comfort is. But it's not only about us, because in my mind, schooling is not really about us. It's about those clients that we service, students in the first instance and their parents in the second instance. And it's this whole issue around what happens to children when parents start to go back to work and when parents are in the economy. So child care, duty of care, and all these issues then become something of concern. And so parents, I'm sure, would prefer for someone to be able to safeguard their children and their welfare while they're at work. It's not so much of a problem if you have 50% unemployment, like the numbers that are being floated around, but what happens when people are returning to work? And so these are the things that we are now looking at. Not just looking at the options, because we kind of know what the options would be, but how those options would actually work. And we're in the process now of developing a technical plan that would speak to that. Once we develop that technical plan, of course, we'll share it with different stakeholders, including the general public, to get views, feedback, and so on. I personally think the biggest sticking point would be this duty of care issue. If we have to go to something where it's either all virtual or partly virtual. But we, as I said, I think earlier, we are governed by the rules around the social distancing. I personally would prefer if the rules could be relaxed a bit, because what we are told generally is that you have to be spaced 6 feet apart. Well, if we had to space students 6 feet apart, just think of a classroom, right? That will diminish our ability to accommodate the students in a significant way, that we will require twice as many rooms and twice as many teachers to do school the way we do school now in terms of accommodating all the students there.
We are practicing social distancing here, and none of us are wearing a mask, all right?
You might be breaking the rules.
No, we're not, because we are, I suppose once you are well distanced, you don't need a mask.
Right.
That is what we're being told.
Well,
and so I just wonder, given the number of students in the system, whether or not mask wearing would be required, should be necessary, given the fact that COVID-19 is going to remain with us.
well, and this is kind of stuff that, or this is kind of policy or information that we are relying on the persons from the Department of Public Health or Ministry of Health to provide us guidance on. So we are in touch with them. And I mean, we are hoping that some of these practical issues would be factored in, and I think they do. But for them, the number one issue is containment of disease spread.
Yes, given the vulnerability of children, some children are asthmatic. Some of them are prone to colds and flus and all the rest of it. And if masks are required, should the government provide masks for students in our public schools?
Well, the Ministry of Education is taking all of those things into account, and as Mr. Taylor has indicated, we are relying on the Ministry of Health, the Public Health Department, and they are getting their regulations or basing their regulations on what is coming to us from the World Health Organization or even Pan American Health Organization. So once they say to us that we are able to allow children, they come into the classroom, they can take their mask off. Once they are 3 feet, 6 feet apart, then we will adjust our regulations based upon what we are told.
And you think you're going to know these things and make decisions on your options because, parents have to prepare for the reopening of schools, prepare uniforms and all the rest of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, uniforms are not going to be any different. I mean, it will be what we're seeing now. If we have to ask people to bring anything, it would be the mask.
Yes.
There is an economic dimension to all of this as well. And you ask the question if the government should provide masks, right? So, I think if the government is able to, it would give that consideration. But, there are limitations. And, they're discussing the budget right now in the Parliament. And, we're going to be borrowing $1.3 billion.
Mm-hmm.
And
at the end of the fiscal year.
Yeah. So, the capacity or the ability of the government is what it is. And we have to try our best to work within those parameters. So,
but the ministry in its budgeting for the next fiscal year should take into consideration that COVID-19 is going to be with us.
But wait a minute now. The ministry in its budgeting is still, this is not, you could write anything down on a piece of paper, but the money got to come to match it.
It's a fluid situation.
So every year we prescribe what we think we need. I would also say that COVID-19 really came when most of our budget preparation had already ended, because by mid-March, we'd already submitted whatever we had to Ministry of Finance, and they were then finalizing things. So, there might have to be some additional activities undertaken by the government to deal with any COVID-19 interventions if the situation with COVID is prolonged and demanding of a lot more in terms of resources. Right?
But shouldn't you reasonably expect it to be prolonged, Mr. Taylor?
Well, you mean, shouldn't the country expect it? Yes, but the extent to which, in terms of linking that with resources, the extent to which the government will be prepared to introduce or to put forth more resources to deal with COVID is the question that I'm seeking to address. And what I'm saying is, in the budget that we have already prepared, we pretty much received what we had last year. So, and in some instances, in specific items, less than we received last year. So, for instance, the resources allocated for busing is about $2 or $3 million less than it was last year. The resources for the school feeding program was diminished by, I think, like $1 million, and other items like that. And so, the question is, how far can you go with the resources that you now have, bearing in mind additional expenses now for COVID? We have already cut back on some programs because of the economic fallout, and now we have increased expenditure. And I don't know that the government will, and I don't know that the government should always have to provide every single component of coming to school. I mean, most children, most families, if wearing masks is what you need to go to church, if it's what you need to go to the food stores, what you need to go down the street, the same mask can be worn to come to school. The same mask can be worn to come to school.
Yes, but
you see what I'm saying?
We don't provide.
You have
to have a variety.
Yeah, but we don't provide the school uniform for students.
Yes.
So they come in their own school uniform, and the mask would just be a part of
the uniform.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
But you have to also take into consideration, Mr. Jones, that students are basically one aspect of the school environment. The Ministry of Education also has to consider how it's going to ensure the safety of all the other persons who work within that environment. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't just simply include the mask. You have to think about the hand sanitizers. You have to think about placing plexiglass in certain areas where there are persons, let's say a receptionist, who has to come into contact with people. You don't want that person to be exposed to persons who they're not even sure of if that person has COVID-19 or not.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
additional things have to be taken into
Having said that, has there been any training program for personnel in the Ministry of Education, particularly our schools, to respond to the crisis?
Yes, sir. The very first thing we did was to try to get the janitorial staff together, because persons hearing about COVID-19 initially were not sure, and we're still not sure exactly how the disease is spread, because today you would see someone saying, okay, you don't have to wear a mask on the outside. Tomorrow somebody else comes out and say, oh yes, you need to wear the mask at all times. So we had to make sure those persons who are responsible for the sanitation, disinfecting of our building or our spaces were aware of what they needed to do. Mr. Ryan from the Ministry of Environmental Health came in and held a workshop for them. And prior to the ministry, well, prior to the staff being told that they had to stay at home or come to work on a rotation basis, we had called those persons within the ministry together to say to them, well, in the office area, headquarters, to say to them, look, here is what we are expecting you to do. When we were told that you have to clean those doorknobs every so often, you have to wipe down areas that are touched often, we had to let our persons know, here is what you have to do. You've been cleaning, we thank you for that, but you have to step up your game to ensure that we reduce the spreading of this disease.
Let's take a break here. When we come back, a whole lot of people want to know what is going to happen with these examinations, the BJC and BGCSE. And so we're going to discuss those when we return. We take this break and we'll come right back. Back here on our program, Jones and Company, and we are talking education today. Given what COVID-19 has wrought on the Bahamas and the ability to educate our children and the coping skills of our people. And our guests on the program today, the Director of Education, Mr. Marcellus Taylor, and the Undersecretary, Ms. Saritha Clarke. And let's talk about the examinations. There are a good number of people who believe that we shouldn't have these examinations, that given the inability of teachers to have one-on-one instructions with our children. There's no interfacing on a one-to-one basis physically, that these examinations should have been postponed until sometime next year. Your response, Ms. Clarke?
Well, the Ministry of Education considered all of the various options. We listened to the discussions that were being held on the outside. But our primary focus in this whole process is the children, the students of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. And when you look at what is the purpose or what are the purposes for examinations, you can think of any number of things. But the most important thing at this stage is providing them with a credential. BJC, when it was introduced back in the 1950s, was introduced so that there would have been a common denominator in terms of providing job opportunities for our students. Because an A in one school, or even in the same school, may not be the same A if you go to another class. So when you look at the national examinations, the results can be used by the employer to determine who they would want to select for a job. In terms of tertiary education, the tertiary institutions have something that is common, which all of our students would have taken, and there is one specific grading system, so they're able to also use that. And then also for personal gratification. And when we also look at the amount of investment, the time that students would have spent in school. from grade 1, or let's say preschool, up to grade 12 in the case of BGCSE, and in the case of BJC, up to grade 9. Students, teachers, parents would have invested a lot of time, money, and other resources. So the Ministry of Education thought it only fitting, because these exams have already been prepared. These were not waiting to be prepared.
So the period March to June and their inability to have one-on-one instruction or to interface with teachers would have in some way impacted their ability to prepare for these examinations. Isn't that right?
Teachers, parents who have children taking examinations are all aware that when COVID-19 caused us to close the educational institutions, would have been somewhere around the second week in March, around the 13th of March, when school would have probably closed. And also, they would have already received an examination timetable. And believe it or not, the first exam in terms of preparation, the art exam, we were supposed to have given the students their art BJC or BGCSE paper so that they could have gone ahead and done their preparation, choose the questions they were going to prepare, and actually go and purchase those materials they would have needed. So when persons talk about...
When was that supposed to happen?
The 30th of March, they were supposed to have been given that question paper.
Okay.
So when persons talk about the period between when COVID-19 caused schools to close and when we actually were supposed to take the exams, we may have had about 3 weeks to the most when students would not have had face-to-face contact before the exam started.
And typically, those 3 weeks would be more on the order of revision as opposed to acquisition of new content. So revision, I mean, I'm not diminishing it, but revision comes in many different forms. Some people have said that because they didn't have access to the internet, then they were disadvantaged. But prior to this year, there was never a talk about not having internet access as a reason why you couldn't study your schoolwork. So we provided those opportunities to support the revision and the preparation exercise for students, not to be considered the reason or the only way in which you could revise and prepare. So we're not trying to even diminish anybody's concerns. There might be concerns. People might feel, you know, I needed a teacher to help me through it a little bit more and so forth. And what we're doing now is we're trying to facilitate and help that to some degree. Now that we have a concrete date, we have permitted teachers starting Monday to organize face-to-face instruction with students and do whatever face-to-face preparation that they feel is appropriate. But we would say that there has to be some level of individual responsibility on behalf of the student and on behalf of parents to help in the preparation, and most of the instruction, if not all of it, was already done. So this revision is and primarily an individual responsibility.
Okay.
And we also need to take into consideration that the BJC exams covers work that would have been taught or studied between grades 7 through 9. And for BGCSE, it would have been grades 10 through 12. So the amount of work that the students should have covered by the time, as Mr. Taylor said, basically it was only, should have been for revision purposes. And in subjects that have coursework, they should have been completing, tidying up the coursework, because the deadline or the due date for coursework to be submitted would have been the Friday, the second Friday in April.
Okay. Let's talk about July 13th, I think, is the date for these examinations.
Yes, sir.
How are you going to execute that? They're not going to be in one room as they were in the past, yes? So,
Well, when you say in one room, when you think of the number of students who normally write these or sit these exams, let's take, for example, this year, we have almost 11,000 students who
yes.
are registered for the BJC and almost 6,000 for BGCSE. And when you look at the schools, let's take government schools. Government schools can have an entry of anywhere from the smallest school in the Family Island maybe have 5, 10 students to the largest schools in Grand Bahama and New Providence, where you can have 200 to 300 students being registered for a particular subject.
Right.
So it was never really just the one room.
Right.
We always had to use
A number of rooms.
a number of rooms.
Yes.
But because of the social distancing, and even with that, in the examination room, we always had the regulation where the desks had to be at least 3 feet apart. And that would have tend to minimize students' desire to look over on somebody else's paper.
Okay.
Okay, or someone to hold up
call
their copying or cheating. Okay,
Right,
and
right.
so that is a regulation already in our system.
Okay.
So now that COVID is with us, and we know that 6 feet is the required distance, we have had to do some reconfiguration to ensure that we have maximum space to accommodate. And then let's take for those exams that are oral exams, for example, English language. There is a listening component. And with that, you have to prepare CDs to be heard by the students for them to be able to answer the questions. So again, that's an additional cost. If we have to have additional rooms, we need to find additional CDs and CD players. So that's another expense on the Ministry of Education to provide additional CD players for those schools that require them.
So you're going to have extra rooms for the seating of the students, and they are going to have their masks, yes?
Yes, and they're going to come, if they come to school in a car, or if they come on the bus where there's a public transportation, or the transportation the Ministry of Education provides, because I'm sure you know that the Ministry of Education has a busing system for students
Yes.
who are in outlying areas. So
Yes.
they would have to come on the bus with a mask, so they should come to school with that mask on as well.
So you have things in place to ensure the successful staging of these examinations, yes?
Yes, sir. We have some plans already in place, and we are continuing to ensure that as far as possible, we place our students in an environment that is safe. Not just our students, because we have to have teachers there or persons there to supervise the invigilation process. So you have to think about all of the persons who are going to be involved in this series of examinations coming up.
Well, given what you are both saying, COVID-19 is not going to have that much of a negative impact on these examinations or even the outcome of the examinations, because students would have had access to these computers, and you, according to Mr. Taylor, there would be some one-on-one instruction for students who need it, eh?
Yes, once teachers are prepared to offer it, and we even provide an extra compensation for that, the teachers are able to organize with the groups of students who are interested. It's not mandatory. You know, if students don't want to do it, they don't have to do it. But once the teacher is prepared and they make the offer, those students will be able to have the division. We have actually also reconfigured the virtual learning platform to put on their content for BJC review, BGCSE review. The company that I talked about one-on-one has also prepared something called a skills assessment gap measure thing that is almost like a test that a student could go on. They can take the test, they can see you know, where they get the questions right. They could see where they're not getting the questions right, and that could help them and any teacher or parent to focus in on the weak areas and to you know, help them with their preparation. So I mean,
So given the technology employed, we should have better results, Ms. Clarke.
Mr. Jones, you know, when we think of the results, we have to also think of the fact that, you know, students themselves have to understand that this is something that I need to help me now as well as in the future. So they have to take the responsibility to do their very best because the exams are designed to show what they know, understand, and can do. So the examinations would have been prepared, as I said to you before, in some instances, almost a year in advance of the exam date.
Students, one component, the teachers, another. And given the what I heard from some teachers, some of them feel that more could be done to assist them in dealing with the issues that they face, and some of them do have some issues.
Yeah.
As I heard one teacher on my radio program, Issues of the Day, complaining about various things. How are you seeking to satisfy teachers that they have all that they need to ensure that these examinations are properly staged and they're going to be taken care of?
Well, there are several areas where the Ministry of Education has made a concerted effort to ensure that teachers and other personnel within the ministry are comfortable to a certain extent to go back into the environs that they would have left at the middle of March, as well as to ensure that the basic things that are required for the examinations are there. The director indicated to you that we are also hoping that teachers would take on the responsibility of providing extra lessons for the students. But in terms of the financial resources that need to be in place for teachers to ensure that they are able to provide the extra lessons, Mr. Taylor said we have compensation already outlined for that. Then there's a psychosocial aspect as well. And we would have actually, from Hurricane Dorian, the Ministry of Education has a unit called the Employee Assistance Program. The Employee Assistance Program with one of our NGOs who were here during the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian actually have put on webinars dealing with different aspects. For example, dealing with stress, the well-being or the social well-being of the student, taking time out for yourself as an adult, whether you were the teacher, the parent, or another employee within the Ministry of Education. And we would have provided those webinars for our personnel to be able to listen to someone at no cost to you, to help you to manage your students and also to help you as the teacher or the employee be comfortable in knowing that COVID-19 is here with me, it is here with the Bahamas, but as a teacher or another employee of the Ministry of Education, my employer has provided opportunities for me to learn more about it, how to become adjusted to it. And as you said rightly, we don't know how long COVID-19 is going to be with us. People refer to the new norm. And you talk about the new norm. The new norm will be something that might linger with us for a year, 2 years. You also said about a vaccine. We don't know when that vaccine will become available. And so we have to adjust.
Did teachers take advantage of these webinars?
Yes, they did. Because we actually assigned different dates for teachers in different regions, different islands, for persons in New Providence, for different sectors of our employees. We actually indicated each week when certain webinars would be coming on.
Ms. Clarke is talking about the psychosocial webinars, but we also had a number of webinars to deal with professional development for teachers. And it was very heartening to see the numbers of persons who participated in those webinars. So I think we did something like 40, I don't know the number, 40-something professional development webinars since March the 13th. And on average, more than 500 teachers participated in those sessions. So, I mean, you know,
So
we see
zooming
this,
worked,
we,
eh?
we see this as a method of us being able to step up our professional development so that people can get a lot more professional development, and this now provides them with support to be, you know, more confident and capable in doing their tasks.
Given the zooming that we've had over the last 3 months in a whole lot of things, this is the wave of the future?
Well, I don't know about the future. It's here.
Yeah, I'm talking about moving forward. You're going to use this technology even more?
Well, yeah, we think so. As a matter of fact, we've been thinking about this for a little time now. How is it that we could utilize these technologies? And you had as your guest, I think, about a year or 2 years ago, our minister and a few other colleagues from Ministry of Education talking about the trying to make smart schools and trying to embrace this. And all of these elements are now coming together a lot faster and a lot more deliberately because of COVID-19. So in a funny kind of way, that dark cloud of COVID-19 has this silver lining of really advancing and enhancing this integration of the ICTs into the work that we do. And we believe that if we do integrate the ICTs in the management, in the instruction, and in the other dimensions of the work that we do, we'd not only become more efficient, but we'd also provide a better quality of service, a better quality of education. Because, for instance, let's say you are a math teacher, and you might be a very good math teacher. I might be a math teacher, and I might be a mediocre math teacher. It doesn't mean that I can't help students. But if you teach a subject, a topic that I struggle with, and it's recorded, I can take that lesson now and show that to my students. I can answer their questions, I can facilitate them. But they would get the opportunity now to have that best instruction on that topic. So my inadequacies don't have to be reproduced in the students. And so these are ways in which, and then also the planning and the preparation around that for me could be less, and I could focus more on my actual assistance to students in the areas where they need it. And so we might end up being able to do more with less effort. And that's the way we want to think about this, so that teachers and school administrators understand that we could have more impact and not necessarily individually have to do more work. But if we work collectively, we could find a way to make that happen.
So you can reduce your expenditure in education by employing technology.
We could reduce our expenditure, but it's not as much the expenditure we're talking about as we're talking about getting more impact.
Yes.
We are a bit more interested in worrying about the student learning outcomes, you know. So I'm not saying that to say that we want to disengage persons or anything like that. What we will do is whatever space we now have people do other things to add value, right? Right. So if a teacher now spends all this time planning and preparing and giving instruction, maybe we could take some of those teachers and work more with students one-on-one who may need extra support. So the student who is general student who has general proficiency, they might get their instruction in a bigger, a virtual type of format. But for the child who needs that more one-on-one with the teacher, we'd have now the resources to be able to do that.
And you would be able to use your strong teachers to impart their skills, their knowledge to a broader number of students. Yes?
That's correct.
Right, and that's why we think the quality could go up if we were to do that. Because we'd be, we say a strong teacher, but all our teachers may have some strength that might be able to be shared across the platform, and all may have deficits that could benefit from what is on the platform. So what it could permit us to do is to always put forward our best. Whatever is our best, we could always put that forward, and whatever our weaknesses, we could always kind of mitigate them.
And so the Ministry of Education, that bureaucracy that we normally hear about, is up to the task. Whether we have COVID-19 continuing another year or so, you are up to the task in dealing with these problems that you face, eh?
Well, you know, we're confident about what we'll be able to do. I mean, we'll make some mistakes along the way, but because this is all new, right? I mean, it's no script, right? But I think we're clear on what we need to do in terms of our general approach to what it is. We're developing plans for things as we can, and I think there's a commitment. And when I say that there's the commitment, I'm not so much talking about from the executive level or from the headquarters level. I'm thinking that there's, from what I'm seeing, you know, I mean, of course, you always have pockets of resistance, but from what I'm seeing, we have a lot of excitement about this time. I believe this is a wonderful time to be in education for a person who is really devoted and dedicated to the craft and to the profession, because there's so many possibilities and they are all coming together. And, you know, we could make it happen if that's what we want to do. See, in life, as you would well know, the position you take in the beginning could determine the outcome. If you don't want it to work, it ain't gonna work. But if you want it to work, you'll find a way.
You'll find a way.
And so we're trying to take the position, or we have taken the position, I say we, me, executives, Ms. Clarke, the minister, the permanent secretary, and also many of our colleagues have taken the position that we'll find a way to make it work.
Mr. Taylor, thank you so very much for coming here today. Thank you. Thank you so very much, Ms. Clarke.
You're welcome, sir.
After all of these years, you are the pro on staging these examinations. You've been doing it now for 20-something years?
Well, I worked at examination and assessment for 23 years.
23 years.
So, yeah, this would probably be the beginning of the BGCSE. This is the 27th sitting, and I would have worked with BJC from about 1977.
Wow.
Before I was born.
Thank you so,
Yes,
thank you so
Taylor.
very much.
Okay.
Thank you for being here today.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you for watching and listening to our program, and I know that you have learned a whole lot about the education system and COVID-19 and how the ministry is dealing with the challenges of COVID-19. Thank you for watching and listening. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.